Chosen one. Before anything shifts around you, something is about to shift within you. You're invited into something deceptively small, an act so simple it almost feels insignificant. Close your eyes, just for a moment. Step into a brief pause where sight offers no guidance, and your mind has no visible evidence to cling to. No confirmation, no proof, no measurable progress, only darkness. This is not symbolic theatre, it is rehearsal, because the story unfolding now does not begin in light, it begins in the absence of it. You've been trained to associate power with visibility favour, with evidence breakthrough with spectacle. Yet heaven does not forge its strongest instruments under applause. It shapes them in obscurity. It tempers them where no one is watching. The greatest authority is not born in visible glory, but in moments where there is nothing external to validate your endurance. This is the shocking reversal. You believed the highlight would define you. Heaven reveals the hidden season has already done so. You thought the breakthrough would prove your strength. Heaven says the darkness already has. What you interpreted as delay was development. What you perceived as silence was instruction. And what you feared was abandonment was actually proximity closer than you realized. Heaven has been observing you, not with pity, not with concern, with astonished respect. While you questioned whether your unseen faithfulness mattered, it was being studied. While you wrestled internally wondering if your consistency in obscurity made any difference, it was being recorded. You remained aligned when there was no applause. You maintained integrity when compromise would have been easier. You chose obedience when outcomes were uncertain. That pattern did not go unnoticed. There is something about how you operate in darkness that has drawn attention beyond what you imagined. And here is where the weight lands. Michael, the commander of heaven's armies, the one who leads celestial forces into battle, has been studying you. Not because you're weak, not because you require rescue, but because there is something in you that even he cannot replicate. Angels function in clarity. They operate with full awareness of divine authority. They move in light without hesitation. But you move without seeing. You trust without evidence. You obey without certainty. That is something heaven's armies do not experience the way you do. Angels do not walk by faith. You do, and what you carry in darkness, trust without proof, endurance without applause, surrender without spectacle, is a kind of power that cannot be manufactured in light. It can only be forged where sight fails and faith remains. The workshop of heaven is not built in brightness, it is constructed in darkness, and you have been training there all along. Somewhere along the way you were taught a hierarchy that quietly shaped how you saw yourself. It was not always spoken directly, but it was implied in sermons, in art, in imagination. Angels were depicted as radiant, powerful, untouchable beings of light who move with authority and certainty. Humans, by contrast, were portrayed as fragile, flawed, and perpetually struggling. You absorbed the message without realizing it. Angels are higher. Humans are less. And if angels are higher, then your suffering must mean you are weak. If angels operate in strength, and you operate in pain, then perhaps your hardship is proof of inferiority. If they stand in glory and you walk through confusion, then maybe you're spiritually lower on the scale. This quiet narrative shaped how you interpreted your own journey. When you wrestled with doubt, you assumed it disqualified you. When you endured darkness, you assumed it diminished you. When you struggled to see clearly, you believed it exposed your limitations. But that hierarchy is incomplete. It confuses difference with deficiency. It assumes that visible power equals superior rank. It overlooks the design of heaven's architecture. Angels are mighty, yes. Scripture describes them as strong in power, obedient to divine command, radiant with glory. They move swiftly, execute judgment guard thrones, deliver messages. Their strength is real. Their authority is formidable. But their power is different, not superior in every dimension. Angels operate in clarity. They see what you cannot see. They stand in the unveiled presence of God without obstruction. They move with certainty because they are not required to walk by faith. They respond to command with immediate obedience because doubt does not cloud their perception. Their environment is light. Yours is not. And that difference is not evidence of inferiority. It is evidence of assignment. You are designed to function in a realm where proof is limited, where evidence is partial, where clarity unfolds gradually. You are placed in a dimension where trust must exist without full visibility. That design is not a downgrade, it is a distinct calling. The narrative shifts when you examine scripture carefully. There is a hidden mystery woven throughout the text, one that rarely receives emphasis. In 1 Peter 1:12, it speaks of the mysteries of salvation realities revealed through the suffering, obedience, and redemption of humanity. And it says something astonishing: these are things angels desire to look into. Pause there. Angels desire to look into what you experience, not because they lack power, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack participation in redemption the way you do. They observe grace, you receive it. They witness faith, you exercise it. They see mercy administered, you are transformed by it. There are dimensions of God's nature that are only revealed through human vulnerability. Angels understand strength. You understand surrender. Angels understand authority. You understand dependence. Angels understand obedience in light. You understand obedience in darkness. These are not lesser qualities, they are different ones, and in certain dimensions they're profoundly rare. Consider this carefully. Angels have never had to trust God through unanswered prayer. They have never had to believe in goodness while surrounded by contradiction. They have never had to choose faith when evidence pointed in the opposite direction. Their obedience flows from unveiled awareness. Yours flows from trust without sight. That substance, faith without proof, is something angels cannot manufacture. It cannot be created in perfect clarity. It cannot be forged in constant visibility. It can only be formed in limitation, in uncertainty, in seasons where heaven feels silent and you still choose alignment. You are taught that your suffering proves weakness. In reality, it reveals capacity. The struggle you endure is not a demotion, it is a workshop. In that workshop, something forms that cannot exist in realms of constant light. Faith becomes muscle, endurance becomes substance, trust becomes architecture within your spirit, and heaven studies it not because you are pitiful, but because you are rare. The chosen one is not chosen because of superiority over others. The chosen one is positioned as a living classroom. Your life becomes instruction. When you endure darkness without abandoning trust, something is demonstrated in the spiritual realm. When you worship without visible evidence, something is revealed about God that even angels cannot express the same way. When you forgive despite pain, when you obey without applause, when you remain aligned without confirmation, you produce a spiritual substance that cannot be replicated in realms where doubt does not exist. You carry experiential knowledge of grace. Angels witness grace. You embody it. You fall and rise. You doubt and return. You struggle and surrender. In that process, you encounter facets of God's mercy and patience that are only accessible to humanity. This does not diminish angels, it reframes you. The lie of spiritual rank suggested a ladder. Angels above, humans below. The truth reveals dimensions, different assignments, different experiences, different revelations. In some dimensions, angels exceed you in strength. In others, you exceed them in intimacy with redemption. Your wounds are not proof of weakness, they are entry points into revelation. When you cry out in darkness and still choose to believe heaven observes something extraordinary. Not because angels are incapable of loyalty, but because loyalty in darkness carries a different weight. It is voluntary trust in the absence of certainty. That trust astonishes. You thought your hidden endurance went unnoticed. It has been studied. You believed your quiet obedience was insignificant. It has been recorded. You assumed your wrestling disqualified you. It has been shaping you into something uniquely reflective of God's character. The hidden workshop of heaven is not reserved for angels. It is active in you. In that workshop, suffering becomes instruction. Delay becomes depth. Silence becomes sharpening. And your humanity, your capacity to choose trust without sight, becomes a revelation in motion. Angels operate from glory. You operate toward it. Angels respond to command. You respond to promise. Angels execute power. You cultivate faith, and faith, especially faith in darkness, is a dimension of power that cannot be replicated by beings who have never needed to believe without seeing. You were not created as a lesser rank. You were created as a different expression of divine design. Your assignment includes vulnerability because vulnerability produces dependence. Dependence produces intimacy. Intimacy produces revelation. Angels see God's holiness. You experience His mercy. Angels witness His authority. You encounter His forgiveness. Angels proclaim His glory. You reflect His grace through transformation. These dimensions are not hierarchical. They are complementary. The lie said you're less because you struggle. The truth says your struggle is producing something angels cannot fabricate. Your endurance in darkness unlocks understanding that does not exist in constant light. Your obedience in uncertainty generates spiritual substance unavailable in perfect clarity. You're not beneath heaven's attention. You're within its study. And the hidden workshop where you thought you were forgotten is the very place where something unparalleled is being formed. Chosen one. Let us return to the real season, not the version you tell when the storm has already passed. Not the controlled narrative you share once healing has softened the edges but the raw collapse itself. The moment when several load-bearing walls in your life gave way almost simultaneously and you realized that what you thought was stable had been quietly under strain for longer than you admitted. It did not unfold politely or sequentially. It felt coordinated, as though pressure arrived from multiple directions, with precise timing leaving you no space to recover between impacts. Betrayal came first, or perhaps it simply hurt the deepest. It did not arrive from a distant enemy, but from proximity from someone whose voice once carried comfort rather than confusion. Trust fractured, and with it went a certain innocence. You replayed conversations in your mind during long nights searching for missed warnings, wondering whether discernment had failed you. You began questioning not only others but yourself, and that internal interrogation was more exhausting than the betrayal itself. The foundation of the relational security cracked, and before you could rebuild it, loss entered the scene. Loss was not merely the disappearance of something tangible, it was the unraveling of expectation. Plans you had quietly built in your imagination dissolved. The version of your future you had rehearsed so often no longer fit reality. You did not just lose opportunity, you lost identity attached to it. An identity loss destabilizes more than circumstance ever could. You felt as though pieces of yourself were slipping away, leaving you to stand in unfamiliar emotional terrain without a map. As if emotional strain were not enough, physical weakness followed. Your body, once reliable, began to signal limitation. Energy diminished. Sleep became inconsistent. Strength that you once assumed was constant felt fragile. Physical exhaustion has a way of amplifying emotional pain, making every thought heavier and every decision harder. You tried to push through at first, telling yourself that resilience meant ignoring fatigue, but the strain persisted. When the body falters, even the strongest minds feel vulnerable, and you were forced to confront fragility you had long ignored. Financial fear then joined the collapse, not dramatically, but persistently. Numbers demanded attention regardless of your emotional state. Responsibilities did not soften because you were overwhelmed. You lay awake calculating scenarios, stretching possibilities in your mind, wondering how long resources would last. It was not loud panic. It was quiet pressure, the kind that hums beneath daily life and never fully disappears. You carried it silently, not wanting to burden others with the weight you were already struggling to manage. And then there was isolation. Not theatrical abandonment, but a subtle thinning of connection. Messages slowed, invitations faded, conversations became surface level. You found yourself surrounded by people, yet internally alone. It was not that no one cared, it was that few understood the depth of what was happening inside you. You felt unseen in your most vulnerable state, and that invisibility deepened the ache. The nights became their own presence in your story. Daylight offered distraction. You could function, speak, perform stability, but night stripped away distraction and left you face to face with silence. The darkness pressed in with a weight that made breathing feel deliberate. You stared at ceilings, replaying events, questioning decisions, wondering if you had misheard God somewhere along the way. The absence of immediate answers amplified every doubt. It would have been understandable, even human, to withdraw spiritually during that time. When wounded people retreat, when disappointed they detach, when exhausted they conserve energy. You could have reduced prayer to formality. You could have allowed bitterness to grow quietly. You could have said, "I believed, and look what happened." Yet something unexpected occurred in that darkness. You did not quit God. You questioned, yes. You wrestled internally. You felt confusion and frustration and moments of raw doubt. But you did not sever connection. Even when your prayers felt thin, you whispered them. Even when scripture felt distant, you reached for it. Even when you felt unheard, you remained present. That decision was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet persistence. And that persistence transformed collapse into training ground. The collapse stripped away what was decorative and exposed what was structural. It removed external reinforcement and forced you to anchor deeper than circumstance. Without applause, without visible momentum, without immediate reassurance, your faith had to operate on substance rather than emotion. You learned to worship without feeling elevated. You learned to pray without instant comfort. You learned to trust without proof. That kind of endurance cannot be manufactured in comfort. It is forged under coordinated pressure. When multiple walls fall at once, you discover whether your foundation rests on environment or covenant. You discovered that your connection to God was not transactional. It was not dependent on blessing alone. It endured even when the visible structure around you weakened. Heaven's training ground rarely resembles triumph. It resembles collapse. But collapse reveals composition. Under pressure, what is superficial cracks, what is essential remains. Your faith thinned, but it did not disappear. Your hope wavered, but it did not die. Your loyalty was tested, but it did not fracture beyond repair. Those nights that felt unbearable were shaping endurance you did not know you would need. You were learning to breathe through uncertainty, to sit in silence without demanding immediate clarity, to separate God's character from your circumstances. That distinction changed you. It deepened you. It matured you. Chosen one, the collapse did not disqualify you. It clarified you. It revealed that beneath strength was dependence, beneath ambition was surrender, beneath performance was covenant. You emerge quieter but steadier, less impressed by surface stability, and more anchored in something unseen yet unshakable. The training ground was hidden, painful and isolating, but it forged resilience that daylight alone could never produce. Chosen one, there is a kind of worship the world recognizes. It is melodic, powerful, moving. It fills rooms, it lifts hands, it swells with music and harmony and shared emotion. It is beautiful, synchronized, supported by rhythm and atmosphere. That kind of worship is good. It is sacred in its own way. But it is not the worship that defined you in your darkest season. Your worship did not have a crowd. It did not have a stage. It did not have a soundtrack rising beneath it. It happened in rooms where no one could see you, in spaces where the air felt heavy and silence felt louder than music. It happened when your emotions were not soaring but frayed, when your strength was not abundant but barely present, when your faith was not glowing with certainty but trembling with effort. There was no emotional momentum to carry you, no collective chorus to reinforce your confidence, no visible breakthrough to validate your praise. There was only you, the silence, and a decision, and you chose to worship anyway. This is the worship that cannot be manufactured. In easier seasons, praise flows naturally. Gratitude rises when provision is visible. Songs come easily when doors open. It is not difficult to celebrate when circumstances align with expectation. But the worship that defined you did not emerge from comfort. It emerged from contradiction. You worshipped when nothing around you justified it. You whispered his name when your prayers felt unanswered. You lifted your hands in rooms where the ceiling felt too low and the air too thick. You did not sing loudly. Sometimes you could barely sing at all. Your voice cracked. Your melody faltered. Sometimes all you could offer was a single word, his name spoken into the dark. That was enough. Because worship is not measured by volume. It is measured by trust. Heaven receives comfortable worship. It delights in celebration. It honors joyful praise. But wounded worship carries a different weight. There is density in it, substance, a gravity that cannot be replicated in ease. When you worship from abundance, you express gratitude. When you worship from pain, you express allegiance. Allegiance in the absence of evidence carries weight. Chosen one, understand what you were doing in those moments. You were not performing, you were not trying to convince yourself everything was fine. You were declaring something deeper than circumstance. You were saying, even here, even now, even without proof, you're still worthy. That declaration shook something unseen. There is a frequency created only by trust without evidence. It cannot be simulated. It cannot be rehearsed. It cannot be produced in comfort. It emerges when a wounded heart chooses surrender instead of withdrawal. When a disappointed spirit chooses devotion instead of bitterness. Your worship was not pretty. It was not polished. It was not convenient. It cost you something. It required pushing past numbness. It required lifting your eyes when you wanted to lower them. It required speaking his name when silence felt safer. That act was not small. It was spiritual detonation. Not detonation in noise, but in frequency. When you worshipped without evidence, you created a sound that did not depend on instruments. You generated alignment in the midst of chaos. You signaled that your trust was not conditional, and in the spiritual realm, that kind of signal carries force. Angels worship in light. They see glory unveiled. They respond to what is visible. You worshipped in darkness. You responded to what you could not see. That difference is not minor. It is monumental. When you chose worship instead of quitting, something shifted. Not necessarily in your circumstances immediately, but in the atmosphere around you. The heaviness did not disappear instantly. The silence did not break dramatically. But resistance lost its authority. Because praise rooted in trust destabilizes despair. You did not need a crowd to validate your devotion. You did not need music to carry your voice. You did not need emotional highs to prove sincerity. Your praise was stripped down to its essence relationship. Relationship that says, I am still here. Relationship that says, I still believe. Relationship that says, you are still God even if I do not understand. That is worship in its purest form. The enemy anticipates abandonment in seasons of collapse. He expects silence from the wounded. He predicts withdrawal from the disappointed. When you worshipped anyway, you disrupted that expectation. You refused to let pain define your posture. You refused to let delay dictate your devotion. That refusal carries weight. Because worship in comfort celebrates blessing. Worship in pain proclaims covenant. Covenant is not dependent on mood. It is not sustained by outcome. It is anchored in commitment. And when you whispered his name into silence, you are reinforcing covenant. You are reminding your own spirit that your connection to God was not transactional. You were not praising because life was easy. You were praising because he is worthy. That distinction transforms everything. There were nights when you did not feel holy, nights when you felt exhausted, frustrated, even confused. Yet even then, something in you reached upward. Not dramatically, not theatrically, simply faithfully. That faithfulness is what heaven notices. Heaven receives millions of songs. It hears choirs. It hears corporate praise rising from stadiums and sanctuaries. But wounded worship, the kind offered when no one is watching, when no one is applauding, when nothing appears to be changing, that carries a resonance that cannot be replicated. It is the sound of trust under pressure, and pressure amplifies authenticity. Chosen one. Your cracked melody was not weakness. It was proof. Proof that your devotion was not anchored in emotional reward. Proof that your faith was not dependent on spectacle. Proof that you were aligned not because it felt good, but because it was true. When you whispered his name in the dark, something detonated in the unseen realm. Not with explosion, but with vibration. A frequency that declares, my trust remains. That frequency disrupts despair. It unsettles doubt. It breaks cycles of spiritual stagnation. Because worship is not passive. It is alignment in motion. Each time you chose praise instead of silence, you shifted the atmosphere around your own heart. Bitterness lost ground. Fear lost authority. Isolation lost permanence. You reminded yourself of who he is when circumstances tried to redefine him, and slowly, quietly your spirit strengthened. Not because the storm stopped immediately, but because you remained anchored through it. The worship that was not convenient, not pretty but real, became your training. It solidified your foundation. It taught you that devotion does not require perfect conditions. It revealed that your relationship with God is strongest when stripped of performance. You're not defined by how loudly you sing in light. You're defined by whether you whisper in darkness. And you did. Chosen one, do not underestimate what that means. The nights when you felt unseen were not empty. The praise you thought was weak was not insignificant. It carried weight. It carried frequency. It carried alignment. And in the hidden workshop of heaven, that kind of worship is never ignored. It is studied. It is honored. It is powerful. Chosen one. When you trace the pattern carefully through scripture, you begin to see that worship rising from wounds does far more than comfort the one who sings it. It destabilizes systems that were designed to confine. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is a spiritual law demonstrated in narrative form, and Paul and Silas stand as its undeniable proof. They were not in metaphorical chains. Their bodies had been beaten publicly, their backs torn open, their feet fastened into stocks inside the innermost cell of a Roman prison. The system surrounding them was constructed to suppress movement and extinguish resistance, and every element of their environment communicated finality. There was no audience applauding their faithfulness, no worship band amplifying their courage, and no visible sign of imminent rescue. What they had was pain, darkness, and a choice. At midnight, when despair typically feels most persuasive, they began to sing. This detail matters deeply because nothing in their external situation had improved. They did not wait for relief before praising. They did not require visible intervention before expressing trust. Their worship did not arise from convenience or emotional uplift. It rose from contradiction. They were bleeding and confined, yet they chose to declare God's worth. The response was not subtle. Scripture does not describe a quiet angel slipping in to unlock their chains while the other prisoners slept undisturbed. Instead, it records a violent earthquake that shook the very foundations of the prison. Doors flew open. Chains fell loose not only from Paul and Silas, but from every prisoner in the building. The structure itself was destabilized. This is the pattern you must understand. Angels are powerful beings capable of precise intervention. They can open doors quietly and execute divine commands with efficiency. However wounded, human worship carries a different kind of force. It does not merely resolve a personal problem, it disrupts systems. When Paul and Silas sang, they were not performing for spectacle. They were aligning with God in a space designed to silence them, and that alignment produced vibrations strong enough to shake foundations. This is not performance, it is spiritual physics. When worship rises from pain rather than comfort, it carries density. It is not fueled by atmosphere, but by covenant. That covenantal trust under pressure generates a frequency that structures built on fear and control cannot withstand. The prison was engineered to contain bodies and suppress hope, yet it could not withstand praise rooted in allegiance. Notice something else: the earthquake did not only free the worshippers, it loosened every chain in the building. The jailer who represented the system confining them ultimately encountered transformation because of what he witnessed. The worship of two wounded men did not simply provide personal endurance. It altered the spiritual climate of an entire environment. Chosen one. Your private praise is not isolated in its impact. You may believe that your worship in dark seasons is merely sustaining you, but it is doing more. You're connected to people, to family lines, to friendships, to future generations. The alignment you choose in private reverberates through those connections. When you refuse to let pain dictate your devotion, you introduce a new frequency into your relational environment. That frequency destabilizes inherited patterns. It challenges cycles of fear. It interrupts silent agreements with despair. When you worship from wounds, you're not simply surviving. You're breaking structures. The enemy expects wounded humans to withdraw. He anticipates bitterness from betrayal and silence from disappointment. When you choose praise instead, you contradict that expectation, and contradiction under pressure produces force. The system assumed Paul and Silas would be broken into quiet compliance. Their worship exposed the system's fragility. Your story is operating on that same pattern. You may not see physical earthquakes or hear chains fall audibly, but do not underestimate what is shifting in unseen places. Someone connected to you is observing how you endure. Someone is recalibrating their own hope because you have not abandoned yours. Your private alignment becomes a public testimony over time, even if the impact unfolds gradually. The difference between angelic intervention and wounded human worship lies in scope. An angel can address a specific barrier, but worship from pain can shake foundations and create freedom beyond the original issue. Paul and Silas were not strategizing systemic reform. They were simply refusing to let chains redefine God's worthiness. Yet their refusal triggered liberation that extended beyond their personal confinement. This is the pattern you're living, whether you realize it or not. Your collapse trained you to sing in darkness. Your isolation taught you to worship without applause. Your pain refined your devotion until it was stripped of performance and anchored in covenant. Now that worship carries weight, it is not decorative, it is structural. When you align with God in wounded spaces, you introduce stability where instability once ruled. You declare that circumstance does not control allegiance. You embody a faith that does not require visible reward to remain loyal. That embodiment unsettles environments built on fear, because fear depends on conditional devotion. Chosen one, your praise is larger than your prison. It is larger than your circumstance. It is larger than your immediate breakthrough. When you worship from wounds, you participate in a pattern that has always broken structures. You generate a frequency that systems cannot sustain, and over time, doors open in places you did not even realize were confined. This is not dramatic exaggeration. It is covenant in action. Your private praise becomes public freedom, not instantly, not theatrically, but inevitably. Because worship that rises from pain carries a force that comfortable praise does not. It is not louder, it is denser. It does not depend on atmosphere, it creates one. And when it rises consistently, structures shift, foundations tremble, and chains visible or invisible begin to loosen. You're not merely enduring your season, you're altering environments, and that is the pattern. Chosen one, you are taught to admire strength that is visible, authority that is unmistakable, and power that operates without hesitation. When you think of Michael, commander of heaven's armies, you imagine clarity without confusion, movement without doubt, obedience without inner conflict. His warfare flows from direct awareness of heaven's order. He does not question the command he receives. He does not wrestle with uncertainty about the outcome. He moves in the light of unveiled glory, and his strength is anchored in full sight of the king he serves. There is no ambiguity in his arena. There is no fog obscuring the battlefield. He operates from certainty, from structure, from authority rooted in direct vision. Your arena is different. You do not move with the advantage of full sight. You operate in a dimension where outcomes are not visible and where God's movement cannot always be proven. You wake up in circumstances that do not always reflect promise. You pray without immediate evidence. You obey without guarantees. The command you sense in your spirit does not come wrapped in blazing clarity. It comes in whispers, impressions, convictions that require discernment. Where Michael sees order clearly, you navigate through layers of uncertainty. Where angels execute from visibility, you choose from partial understanding. This difference is not a weakness. It is a distinction in assignment. Angels obey from direct awareness of glory. They respond to commands issued from the throne they can behold. Their obedience is immediate because doubt has no environment in which to grow. You, however, obey from a place where doubt is possible. You obey while questions linger. You obey when circumstances contradict what you believe. You obey when silence stretches longer than expected, and heaven does not explain itself on your timeline. That obedience carries a different substance. When Michael engages in warfare, he does so with full confidence in the structure of divine authority. He knows the outcome before the battle begins, because he sees the throne that guarantees it. His strength is unquestionable, his loyalty unwavering, his clarity intact. But he does not operate under the conditions you face daily. He does not wake up wondering whether the promise will manifest. He does not kneel in prayer uncertain whether his cry has been heard. He does not worship while feeling emotionally abandoned. You do. Chosen one, you live in the tension of faith without full disclosure. You trust when evidence is incomplete. You align when clarity is partial. You step forward when the map is unfinished. You declare God's goodness while standing in situations that appear contradictory. That tension produces something angels do not need to cultivate because they do not inhabit your arena. Faith under silence is your terrain. Angels do not need to learn how to trust in the absence of visible glory because they dwell in its presence. They do not need to persevere through seasons where heaven feels quiet because they operate within constant awareness of divine order. Their obedience is glorious, but it is not formed in ambiguity. Yours is. Heaven's warriors respect this because it reveals a dimension of loyalty that cannot be replicated in constant light. When you choose trust without proof, you generate a substance unique to humanity. When you continue believing while unanswered prayers echo back to you, you produce endurance angels never have to practice. When you worship in emotional dryness, when you obey in relational betrayal, when you hold on to covenant in financial uncertainty, you're operating in a dimension of allegiance that is born only in limitation. Michael's authority is immense, but it does not require the cultivation of faith in darkness. His warfare emerges from certainty. Yours emerges from decision, and decision in uncertainty carries extraordinary weight. Consider this carefully chosen one. Angels see glory and respond accordingly. You do not always see glory, yet you respond as though you do. That choice, repeated day after day in ordinary life, reveals something profound about the human spirit when aligned with God. You're not driven by visible reinforcement. You're sustained by conviction. You're not strengthened by unveiled reality. You're strengthened by promise. There are mornings when you wake up without emotional confirmation of purpose. There are nights when you kneel without immediate reassurance. There are seasons when obedience feels lonely and misunderstood, yet you continue. You align your actions with a word you cannot physically see embodied yet. You anchor yourself in covenant when circumstances offer alternative narratives. That is something even Michael cannot reproduce. Not because he lacks power, but because he lacks your environment. The environment of uncertainty, of hiddenness, of delay is uniquely human. It is the soil where faith grows. Angels do not need that soil. They are not planted in it. They are not required to cultivate trust without sight because sight surrounds them. Heaven's warriors observe your endurance with respect because it reveals something about God that even they encounter differently. You reveal God's faithfulness through trust without proof. You display his worth through worship without visible reward. You manifest allegiance in the absence of applause. That manifestation becomes testimony in realms beyond your awareness. You've assumed that your struggle diminishes you. In truth, it distinguishes you. The very uncertainty that frustrates you is the arena where your faith becomes luminous. When you continue obeying while unsure of outcome, you declare that God's character is sufficient even when his methods are mysterious. When you remain aligned in seasons where clarity is withheld, you demonstrate that relationship matters more than reassurance. Michael's warfare is dramatic and decisive, but your warfare is quieter and no less significant. You fight through doubt without abandoning trust. You resist despair without immediate reinforcement. You stand firm when external validation is absent. That perseverance generates a spiritual density angels do not need to manufacture, because they are not called to navigate obscurity. Heaven's order includes both arenas, the visible strength of angelic hosts and the hidden endurance of human faith operate in harmony. But do not confuse difference with hierarchy. Your obedience in uncertainty is not inferior to obedience in clarity. It is distinct and deeply valued. Chosen one, when you continue to believe through silence, when you refuse to let delay define God's character, when you worship in darkness without evidence of dawn, you are producing something irreplaceable. You're embodying faith under silence, a dimension of loyalty that reveals trust at its purest form. And heaven's warriors, even those as mighty as Michael, recognize the weight of that trust. Chosen one, the story must turn here, because if we stop at worship alone, we miss the deeper current that carried you through the collapse. Worship was not the ultimate power. It was the vehicle. It was the expression, the signal, the alignment. But beneath the whisper of praise, beneath the cracked melody offered in darkness, something more formidable was forming. The true power was not that you sang. The true power was that you learned how to trust again after trust had been shattered. That is the mastery. Anyone can worship in momentum. Many can even worship in crisis, when adrenaline fuels desperation and urgency forces prayer. In the early shock of disappointment, emotion still burns brightly enough to cry out. But what happened to you did not end in a single moment of collapse. It lingered. It stretched. It settled into weeks and months where the initial intensity faded and the real test began. The crisis passed, but the questions remained. The betrayal quieted, but the memory persisted. The loss stabilized, but the ache did not disappear. This is where most people build memorials instead of rebuilding trust. A memorial says, "I believed once, and look what happened." A memorial preserves the disappointment as a permanent reference point. It does not deny God entirely, but it adjusts expectation downward. It softens hope to protect the heart. It says, "I will still attend, still pray, still function, but I will not lean that deeply again." Memorial faith is cautious. It survives, but it does not surrender. You stood at that crossroads. Your disappointment tried to turn your faith into a monument to what did not happen. It invited you to reinterpret your devotion as naivete. It suggested that wholehearted trust had been the problem. It whispered that if you had guarded your expectations more carefully, the pain would not have cut so deeply. That voice sounded reasonable. It sounded protective. It sounded wise. But you did something rarer. You rebuilt trust, not impulsively, not blindly, not because the scars vanished. You rebuilt it slowly, knowingly, with full awareness of what it cost to trust. You did not pretend the betrayal never occurred. You did not erase the nights of silence. You did not romanticize the collapse. Instead, you chose to trust again while remembering everything. That is refined faith. There is a difference between untouched belief and rebuilt trust. Untouched belief is innocent. It has not yet been tested deeply. It expects alignment between promise and outcome without significant contradiction. It is sincere, but it is unproven. Rebuilt trust, however, emerges from exposure. It has seen disappointment. It has endured silence. It has wrestled with doubt and returned anyway. When you trust again after devastation, you are no longer trusting from assumption. You're trusting from knowledge. You know God did not prevent every loss. You know He did not shield you from every betrayal. You know His timing did not match your preference. And yet, with that awareness, you lean back in. That is mastery. Most people trust once in crisis because they are desperate. When the crisis subsides, but clarity does not immediately follow, their trust thins. They may not abandon faith entirely, but they reduce it to manageable proportions. They lower their vulnerability. They limit their surrender. They maintain belief, but they withdraw intimacy. You did not. You rebuilt intimacy, and you did so while the scar tissue was still sensitive. Chosen one. Do you understand how rare that is? It is one thing to trust before pain. It is another to trust after pain. Before disappointment, trust flows from hope. After disappointment, trust flows from decision. Hope may fluctuate, but decision anchors. When you rebuild trust, you are not ignoring reality. You are reframing it. You are acknowledging that God's character is not defined by a single season. You are separating His nature from your expectations. You are recognizing that the collapse did not nullify covenant. That recognition required maturity, humility, and courage. Because trusting again feels risky. It requires opening the same heart that was once wounded. It requires praying without guarantees that the answer will align with your preference. It requires surrendering control even after learning how fragile circumstances can be. You are fully aware that trust exposes vulnerability, yet you chose exposure over self-protection. That choice produced something extraordinary. Rebuilt trust becomes the rarest spiritual substance because it is refined. It has passed through fire. It has endured tension. It has confronted doubt without being consumed by it. Refined faith is not loud. It does not need constant reassurance. It does not depend on emotional highs. It is steady because it has survived shaking. Untouched belief can be enthusiastic but unstable. Refined faith is quieter but immovable. When disappointment tried to redefine your theology, you did not let it. When silence tempted you to reinterpret God as distant, you resisted that narrative. You allowed yourself to grieve, but you refused to let grief dictate your ultimate conclusion. You acknowledged confusion without surrendering covenant. That is power. The enemy is not primarily intimidated by worship that arises from comfort. He is unsettled by trust that returns after betrayal. Because when trust is rebuilt, it cannot be manipulated by surface circumstances. It has already endured loss. It has already processed delay. It has already survived silence. You're no longer trusting because you assume everything will go well. You're trusting because you have decided that God's character is worthy, even when outcomes vary. That decision stabilizes you. It transforms your worship from emotional reaction into covenantal alignment. It shifts your obedience from hopeful optimism to deliberate loyalty. It changes the way you move through uncertainty. You're no longer easily shaken by contradiction because contradiction has already visited you. Chosen one rebuilt trust carries authority. It allows you to pray without panic. It allows you to wait without despair. It allows you to surrender without feeling naive. You've learned that trusting God does not guarantee ease, but it guarantees alignment. And alignment is deeper than comfort. The story flips here because the power was never merely that you worshipped in darkness. Worship was the vehicle through which trust was reconstructed. Each whispered praise, each quiet prayer, each refusal to detach from God was a brick in the rebuilding process. Slowly, deliberately, you constructed something stronger than what existed before. Before, your faith may have been passionate but partially dependent on outcome. Now it is resilient because it has been purified. It has confronted the question, what if it does not unfold the way I imagined and answered I will trust anyway? That answer is rare. Heaven recognizes it. Angels observe it. Because refined faith reveals a dimension of loyalty that untouched belief has not yet learned. It is not naive devotion. It is informed allegiance. You trusted once before you knew pain. Now you trust knowing pain. That distinction matters. Chosen one, this is the true power emerging from your story. Not flawless worship, not dramatic breakthrough, but rebuilt trust that stands even with scars visible. A faith that does not deny disappointment but refuses to be defined by it. A covenant that survived shaking and returned stronger. That substance cannot be manufactured in ease. It is forged in collapse and rebuilt through decision. And once formed, it becomes more valuable than belief that has never been tested. You did not become hardened, you became refined, and refined trust is one of the rarest spiritual substances heaven ever beholds. Chosen one before you ask for another sign, before you look for external confirmation that something has shifted in you. Pause and consider the evidence already present. You survived what should have erased your faith. That is not exaggeration. The collapse you endured, the betrayal that fractured your confidence, the silence that stretched your endurance, the loss that unsettled your identity, any one of those could have turned devotion into distance. Together they could have dismantled belief entirely. And yet you're still here. You're still reaching upward. That reaching quiet and persistent is itself proof that an upgrade has already taken place within you. There was a time when your faith was enthusiastic, right, perhaps even expressive in ways that felt effortless. You trusted because hope felt natural. You believed because expectation aligned with desire. You prayed with confidence that outcomes would confirm what you sensed. That version of faith was sincere, but it had not yet been stretched deeply. It had not been exposed to sustained contradiction. It had not been required to stand without visible reinforcement. The season you walk through changed that texture completely, and what emerged on the other side carries a different weight. Your faith now is less naive, less performative, and more grounded in honesty. You no longer feel compelled to present strength that does not exist. You do not mask grief with artificial positivity. You do not interpret unanswered questions as personal failure. Instead, you have learned how to speak truthfully to God about pain without withdrawing from Him. That shift alone reveals maturity. Where once you might have believed that strong faith required the absence of doubt, you now understand that real faith can coexist with vulnerability. You have discovered that honesty does not weaken devotion, it deepens it. You can now hold tension without breaking. That ability is evidence of transformation. You love God while grieving what you lost. You trust His plan while acknowledging the cost it has required from you. You pray for restoration while admitting that the process has been exhausting. There is no longer a need to resolve every contradiction immediately. You have learned how to live within unanswered spaces without allowing those spaces to define your theology. That capacity is not accidental. It was formed in the very nights that felt unbearable when silence pressed in and you were forced to choose between resentment and resilience. Before the collapse, tension might have unsettled you more quickly. You might have felt compelled to fix the discomfort, to force clarity, to interpret delay as disapproval. Now, however, you recognize that tension is often part of growth. You no longer panic at the first sign of ambiguity. You breathe through it. You remain aligned within it. You have learned that God's character is not invalidated by your incomplete understanding. That realization stabilizes you in ways that others notice, even when you do not. The texture of your faith carries evidence of refinement. It is quieter but stronger. It does not require constant validation. It is less reactive to circumstance and more anchored in conviction. When good news arrives, you celebrate with gratitude rather than entitlement. When difficulty resurfaces, you respond with steadiness rather than shock. This steadiness is not numbness, it is resilience. It is the product of a trust that has been tested and rebuilt rather than merely assumed. Because of this transformation, people in crisis are drawn to you in ways you may not fully understand. They sense something different in your presence. It is not that you have perfect answers or that your life is free from complication. It is that you carry medicine for shattered trust. Your words do not sound hollow when you speak about endurance because you have endured. Your encouragement does not feel rehearsed because it is born from lived experience. When someone confesses disappointment in God, you do not rush to correct them. You sit with them because you know the weight of that confession. Your presence communicates safety, not because you eliminate pain, but because you have navigated it without abandoning covenant. Others recognize that you can hold their grief without trying to minimize it. They sense that you will not shame their questions because you have asked your own. In a world where many either deny struggle or surrender to it, you embody a third way honest faith. That embodiment becomes medicine. This is how you know you have already been operating in the upgrade. The very thing that tried to dismantle you has become the source of your authority. Not authority in the sense of dominance, but authority in the sense of authenticity. When you speak about trust, it is not theoretical. When you encourage perseverance, it is not abstract. When you testify about God's faithfulness, it is not based on uninterrupted blessing, but on sustained alignment through contradiction. Chosen. One, notice how differently you respond now when pressure resurfaces. The initial shock may still come, but it does not consume you as it once might have. You've learned how to pause rather than panic, how to pray rather than project worst-case outcomes, how to sit with discomfort rather than flee from it. These responses are not accidental, they're evidence. Evidence that your faith has matured beyond performance. Evidence that your devotion is no longer contingent upon convenience. You can acknowledge disappointment without abandoning hope. You can admit exhaustion without surrendering calling. You can confess confusion without withdrawing loyalty. That balance reveals strength that untouched belief does not possess. Untested faith often demands resolution before it feels secure. Refined faith remains secure even when resolution is delayed. The upgrade is visible in the way you approach relationships as well. You no longer trust recklessly, but you also do not barricade your heart completely. You discern without becoming cynical. You extend grace without denying wisdom. The betrayal that once threatened to harden you has instead taught you depth. You recognize human limitation without redefining divine character. That distinction allows you to move forward without bitterness. Your continued reaching upward, even when circumstances fluctuate, testifies to mastery that you may not yet fully appreciate. Mastery does not mean perfection. It means alignment sustained through adversity. It means trust rebuilt with open eyes. It means devotion chosen repeatedly rather than assumed automatically. When you wake up and pray, when you worship without needing emotional intensity, when you surrender outcomes you cannot control, you demonstrate that the collapse did not define you, it refined you. People in crisis gravitate toward you because they sense this refinement. They are not looking for someone untouched by pain. They're searching for someone who has survived it without losing their anchor. In your presence, they feel permission to hope again. Not because you promise quick solutions, but because you embody the possibility of rebuilt trust. Your story becomes a quiet assurance that faith can endure shaking and still stand. Chosen one, the evidence is already present. You have not simply recovered, you have been upgraded. Your faith carries density. Your trust carries history. Your devotion carries scars that no longer bleed but testify. You can love God honestly without pretense, without denial, and without fear that questions will disqualify you. That honesty is strength, and the fact that you're still reaching upward, still choosing alignment, still whispering His name with conviction, even after everything you have faced, proves that what tried to erase your faith has instead deepened it. You're operating from refined trust now, and that refinement is visible not in loud declarations, but in steady presence. It is seen in how you endure, how you comfort, how you remain. That is the evidence. Chosen one when trust is rebuilt and refined rather than abandoned. Heaven does not ignore it. Mastery in the Spirit is never wasted. It is documented through responsibility. What you endured did not simply stabilize you, it qualified you. There is a pattern in Scripture that reveals how God responds to proven trust. He entrusts more, not recklessly, not prematurely, but deliberately. When faith has been tested and found, steadfast assignment expands. When loyalty remains intact through contradiction, influence increases. What you rebuilt in private now activates weight in public. Your prayers begin to carry a different authority. They are no longer fueled by naive expectation, but by covenantal understanding. When you intercede now, you are not praying from theory but from history. You have seen delay. You have survived silence. You have confronted disappointment without surrendering relationship. That experience shapes your language in the Spirit. There is gravity behind your words because they are not aspirational, they are anchored. Heaven responds differently to prayers that have endured fire. They are not louder, they are denser. They do not beg for reassurance, they declare alignment. As your assignment expands, so does your responsibility. You may notice that people increasingly seek your counsel during crisis. You may sense that opportunities arise that require deeper discernment than before. This is not coincidence. When trust is refined, God entrusts stewardship. Your presence in certain spaces is no longer accidental, it is strategic. The collapse that once felt like disqualification has become preparation for influence you did not initially anticipate. With expanded assignment comes expanded protection. This protection does not operate solely at the level of your personal safety, it extends to what is connected to your purpose. Scripture repeatedly demonstrates that when God marks someone for assignment, He guards not only the individual but the lineage and relationships tied to their obedience. Abraham's covenant affected generations. Joseph's endurance preserved a nation. Esther's courage secured a people. In the same way, your rebuilt trust activates covering beyond yourself. The boundaries of protection widen because your obedience now carries communal implications. This does not mean difficulty disappears. It means that difficulty no longer defines the outcome. There is a difference between encountering opposition and being overcome by it. Your resilience has altered the spiritual climate around you. You're no longer reacting to darkness as though it is foreign territory. Darkness has become your arena, not your prison. You've learned how to navigate silence without surrendering faith, and that skill changes how opposition interacts with you. Scripture reinforces the signature of this power through a single word that appears repeatedly in moments of tested devotion yet. The word yet is the sound of rebuilt trust. Habakkuk declared that even if the fig tree did not blossom and the fields yielded no food, yet he would rejoice. Job, stripped of comfort and certainty, asserted that though he was tested, yet he would trust. That small word carries enormous weight because it bridges contradiction and covenant. It acknowledges reality without surrendering allegiance. It admits loss without abandoning loyalty. When you say yet, you're not denying pain. You're declaring that pain does not have final authority. That declaration is the audible signature of refined faith. It is the language of someone who has seen collapse and chosen covenant anyway. The word does not erase grief. It reorients perspective. It transforms complaint into commitment. It converts despair into declaration. However chosen one's assignment expands and authority increases, so does the likelihood of testing. There is a pattern here as well. When faith matures, the enemy often responds with a familiar echo, designed to make you regret rebuilding. He does not usually introduce entirely new temptations. He replays old wounds. He revisits familiar fears. He whispers the same doubts that once nearly convinced you to retreat. The strategy is not creativity, it is repetition. He hopes that memory will destabilize what mastery has stabilized. You may encounter circumstances that resemble the earlier collapse. A similar tone of betrayal, a similar stretch of silence, a similar financial tension. The details may differ, but the emotional resonance will feel familiar. This is not evidence that you failed to grow. It is a test of whether your growth has taken root. The echo will attempt to provoke the old reaction to tempt you into lowering expectation again, to suggest that rebuilding trust was naive. But here is the crucial difference: you're not who you were then. Darkness is no longer your prison. It is your arena. An arena implies engagement with awareness. You understand its contours. You recognize its tactics. You're not surprised by its pressure. Where once darkness felt suffocating, now it feels navigable. You've learned how to breathe there. You've learned how to worship there. You've learned how to say, yet there. The enemy's strategy depends on regret. If he can convince you that trusting again was a mistake, he can shrink your influence. If he can persuade you to memorialize disappointment once more, he can limit your assignment. But regret loses power when you remember the evidence of transformation. You've already walked through collapse and emerged aligned. You've already rebuilt trust with open eyes. You've already discovered that obedience under silence produces authority. When the familiar echo arrives, you will feel it. The old fear may stir momentarily, the memory may surface, yet you now possess perspective. You can differentiate between repetition and destiny. You can recognize that testing is not punishment but confirmation. Confirmation that what was rebuilt is genuine. Heaven entrusts more because mastery has been demonstrated. The enemy tests more because influence has increased. Both responses indicate movement. The difference lies in your posture. When you meet testing with the same yet that defined your rebuilding, you reinforce alignment. You signal that trust is no longer conditional. Chosen one, understand what this activates next. Your authority in prayer deepens because your language carries history. Your protection widens because your purpose extends beyond you. Your influence increases because your presence stabilizes others. The word yet becomes instinctive rather than forced. And when echoes of the past attempt to intimidate you, you respond not with panic, but with remembrance. You remember that collapse did not erase you. You remember that silence did not defeat you. You remember that betrayal did not define you. That memory becomes shield and anchor simultaneously. Darkness may revisit, but it no longer confines. It becomes terrain where your refined trust operates effectively. The same arena that once exposed vulnerability now reveals strength. And because you have already proven allegiance under pressure, heaven continues to entrust, and the enemy's echoes lose their persuasive power. This is the next activation. Not louder faith, but steadier faith. Not dramatic conquest, but sustained authority. The power you carry is not fragile because it was rebuilt intentionally, and when testing attempts to steal it, you answer with the word that has become your signature yet. The same darkness that once felt like abandonment now stands revealed as something entirely different. What you interpreted as distance was design. What you experienced as silence was formation. The very environment that once made you question your worth has become the workshop where heaven's rarest power is forged. It was never a void, it was a forge. It was never empty, it was active. Beneath the surface of your confusion, something precise and deliberate was taking shape, something that could not have been formed in constant light. Michael operates in light with certainty. He moves from clarity, from unveiled glory, from immediate awareness of divine order. His obedience flows from sight. His strength is anchored in what he sees. That is his arena, and it is magnificent. But you operate differently. You move in spaces where outcomes are not always visible, where prayers are not instantly answered, where silence stretches longer than you expected. You choose trust without the reinforcement of full revelation. And heaven does not view that as inferior, it recognizes it as essential. Your trust in darkness is not a substitute for strength, it is a distinct expression of it. When you align yourself with God without proof, when you remain steady without spectacle, when you say yet while tears still linger, you demonstrate a dimension of faith that cannot be manufactured in perfect clarity. That dimension carries weight in the spiritual realm. It is not loud, but it is rare. It is not dramatic, but it is powerful. Heaven leans towards that kind of faith because it reveals covenant at its deepest level. You're not behind, you're not forgotten, you're not weak. The delay you experienced was not evidence of disqualification, it was evidence of training. You were placed in the environment that produces refined trust, not untouched belief. You were shaped in conditions that required decision rather than assumption. That shaping has marked you. It has steadied you. It has given your faith a density that cannot be easily shaken. So when the next dark moment comes, and it will because life unfolds in cycles rather than straight lines, you will not panic the way you once did. You will recognize the terrain. You will remember what darkness produces in you. Instead of interpreting it as abandonment, you will see it as opportunity for refinement. Instead of retreating, you will remain aligned. Instead of asking whether you are forgotten, you will understand that you are being formed. The charge is simple and intimate: stay. Stay aligned, stay trusting, stay honest. You now know what is happening beneath the silence. You now understand that the workshop is not a place of rejection but of rare formation. And because you know that darkness no longer defines you, it develops you.